What drives a duke to exile the one woman bound to him by vow and blood? Who is the child born in silence, far from the estate that should have been his birthright? And what will happen the day the truth forces its way back through those iron gates? Stories like this one don't stay buried forever, and neither do heirs. If you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment, because what unfolds here will stay with you long after the story ends. Tell me in the comments, do you believe a man consumed by fury can ever truly deserve a second chance? Now, let the story begin. The fire in the study had burned low by the time Dorian Thornvale spoke the words. He did not shout them. That was what Isolde would remember in the years that followed. Not the fury in his voice, but the terrible quiet of it. The way a man who has decided something speaks with the flatness of someone who has already grieved and already buried. You will leave Thornvale by morning. She had stood very still. The room was dark at its edges, the last of the fire casting long shadows across the shelves of books he never let anyone touch. The desk where she had once left a small sketch of the gardens as a gift, and he had kept it. She had seen it there for months, proof of something she could not name. The sketch was gone now. She did not know when it had disappeared. Dorian. Her voice was steady. She had not yet learned how much that steadiness would cost her. I will not discuss it. He turned toward the window, his back to her. The posture of a man who understood that if he looked at her face, he might not be able to do what he had decided to do. The arrangements will be made. You will be provided for, but you will not remain in this house. She wanted to ask him what he had been told. She knew with a particular clarity that grief sometimes gives, that something had been said to him, something that had reached him before she could, something that had filled the space between them with a version of her that was not true. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way he was holding himself together through certainty, because certainty was the only thing strong enough to keep the feeling down. She wanted to say, "Ask me, whatever it is, ask me." But Dorian Thornvale had never been a man who asked. He had been a man who decided, and in deciding, closed every door. "Very well," she said instead. And that was the sentence she would spend the next 20 years turning over in her hands. Very well. 2 words that meant, I will not beg, I will not diminish myself to reach a man who has already turned away. 2 words that cost her everything and saved the only thing she had left, her dignity, in a room where everything else had already been taken. She did not tell him about the child. She had known for 11 days. She had been holding the knowledge like something precious and fragile, waiting for the right moment, the right light, the right version of him, the one who occasionally looked at her across a dinner table as though surprised to find her beautiful, the one who had once pressed his mouth to her temple in the dark and said nothing, which was, she had come to understand, his closest language for tenderness. That version of him was not in this room. The man in this room had a set jaw and cold gray eyes and a back turned firmly toward the woman he was dissolving from his life. And Isolde understood, with the devastating precision of a person seeing something clearly for the first time, that if she told him now, in this room, in this silence, with his shoulders held like armor and his hands braced against the window frame, he would not soften. He would only have one more reason to feel that she had been trying to manipulate him. So she held the secret inside her chest, where it sat alongside everything else she was not allowed to say, and she walked out of the study, and she did not look back at the window. She thought he might call after her. He did not. The carriage came at dawn. A gray, still morning, the kind that offers no drama, no storm to match the occasion, no wind to give the departure weight. Just pale English light settling over the Thornvale grounds with the indifference of a world that did not particularly notice one woman leaving. Isolde wore the dove-gray traveling dress. She had chosen it deliberately. Not mourning, not capitulation. Something between. A color that said, I am leaving, and I am not broken by it. She allowed herself one look at the house as the carriage moved away. Stone and silence. a door already closed. Somewhere behind those walls, she imagined, Dorian was standing at his study window. Or perhaps he was not. Perhaps he was already at his desk, already reorganizing the world into the shape of a life that did not contain her. She pressed one hand briefly against her stomach. "We are going," she thought, "to no one and to someone simultaneously, and we will be all right." She did not entirely believe it yet, but she had said it, and that was where all survivable things begin. The cottage had no name. That was the first thing Isolde noticed when she arrived. Every estate, every house she had ever known carried a name like a title, something to announce itself to the world. This place simply existed, quietly, at the end of a narrow lane in Wiltshire, surrounded by ash trees and the particular silence of land that had never been asked to be impressive. She learned to love it with the fierce, specific love of someone who has been given very little and chosen to make it enough. Callum was born in February, in the room with the low ceiling and the window that looked out onto the frozen garden. He arrived in the early hours, in the presence of a village midwife and Isolde's elder sister Maren, who had come without being asked and stayed without being invited to leave, which was, Isolde understood, the truest form of love she had ever witnessed. She held him and felt, for the first time since the study at Thornvale, that she was standing on solid ground. He had his father's jaw. Even then, impossibly, already, that particular set of bone that she recognized the way you recognize a piece of music you heard once and never forgot. She traced it with one finger in the gray February light and felt something move through her that was not grief exactly, and not joy exactly, but the particular ache of a thing that is both at once. "What will you name him?" Maren asked from the chair by the fire. Isolde looked at her son, at his dark hair, already a suggestion of what it would become, at the pale flicker of his eyes, not yet decided on their color. "Callum," she said. "Callum Merrow." Her name, not his. A decision made in a single quiet breath that contained the whole of her situation, the acknowledgement that she could not give him the name he was owed, and the refusal to give him nothing at all. She raised him in the cottage and in the fields around it, and in the small lending library in the village where she became, over years, a familiar and somewhat mysterious figure. The widow Merrow, people assumed, which she never confirmed and never denied. A woman of evident refinement, living in deliberate simplicity. A woman whose son had extraordinary eyes and an unsettling habit of looking at people as though he could read them. He was a kind child. That was the thing that undid her most regularly. Not the jaw, not the eyes, but his fundamental gentleness, which she recognized as something she had chosen to believe Dorian possessed and had never been certain of. Seeing it made real, walking around her kitchen asking questions about the drawings he found in her old portfolios, she felt a grief she could never fully explain and would never fully resolve. "Who drew these?" he asked once. He was 7, with ink on his fingers and a seriousness beyond his years. "I did," she said. "Who is the house?" She had not realized she had kept that particular sketch. Thornvale's East Wing, done from memory, in a moment of what she could only describe as involuntary longing. She had not meant to keep it, and yet there it was. "A house I knew once," she said. "A long time ago." He looked at it for another moment with those pale green eyes. Her eyes, she told herself. Hers entirely. "It looks sad," he said, and set it down and went back to his breakfast. She told him the truth in pieces, the way you tell a child something that is too large for a single telling. First, that his father had been a man of great position. Then, that they had parted under difficult circumstances. Then, when he was 15 and beginning to acquire the jawline in full, undeniable force, that his father was a duke and that Callum was, by blood, by right, by every law of inheritance, his heir. He received each piece with the same composure he brought to everything. He did not rage. He did not weep. He sat very still at the kitchen table, in the way that reminded her every time of a man standing at a study window, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Does he know?" "No," she said. Another silence, longer. "Did you choose not to tell him?" She had prepared for many versions of this question. She had rehearsed answers that were fair, and answers that protected him, and answers that were simply the truth without armor around it. She chose the last one. "I chose to protect you," she said. "And I chose to protect myself. And I have never been entirely certain, in all the years since, whether those were the right reasons or only the necessary ones." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Large now, his hands, a man's hands, and said nothing, which was, she realized, with a sound that caught in her throat, his closest language for tenderness. She thought, "There he is." And she did not mean Callum. It was the letter that changed everything. He was 20 when he found it, not by accident, not entirely. He had been looking, in the quiet, persistent way of a person who has understood for years that there is something in the house that explains the thing no one has fully said. It was among her older papers, in a small cedar box that smelled of another life. A letter bearing a seal he recognized immediately, because she had sketched that seal once in the margins of a drawing, and he had asked about it, and she had said, "Nothing, an old habit." The Thornvale crest, broken at one edge where the wax had been opened and never refolded. The letter was not addressed to her. It was addressed to his father, from a man named Silas Price, written 12 years prior, and never sent. Callum read it once, carefully, the way he read everything. Then he folded it, placed it back in the box, and closed the lid. He did not tell his mother he had found it. Not yet. He sat very still for a long time, in the room with the low ceiling and the window that looked out onto the garden, and he thought about a house that looked sad in a sketch, and a mother who had given him her name instead of his, and a man in London who did not yet know what a single furious night had cost him. Then he began, quietly, to plan. London in the autumn of 1903 was a city that rewarded surfaces. What you wore, where you stood, who acknowledged you across a ballroom. These were the currencies that mattered, and they were exchanged with the precision of a financial market and the cruelty of one. Callum Merrow arrived into it with a single leather case, a letter of introduction to a firm of architects on Gower Street, and a face that caused, in those first weeks, a faint and unaccountable unease in certain older members of society who could not have explained why. He did not seek attention. That was perhaps what drew it. He worked. He was exceptionally good, the kind of good that is difficult to dismiss or diminish, the kind that speaks quietly and makes everyone around it slightly uncomfortable. His employer, a broad-shouldered Scotsman named Rennie, who had no patience for aristocratic pretension and considerable patience for talent, promoted him within 4 months and introduced him at a small supper to Lady Rosalind Ashby. Rosalind looked at him across the table and felt the floor tilt very slightly beneath her. She had known Isolde Merrow. More than known, she had watched, from the comfortable distance of a woman who told herself she was not involved, as the Duchess of Thornvale was removed from the world that should have kept her. She had told herself there was nothing to be done. She had told herself it was not her place. She had spent 12 years telling herself variations of this, with the particular fluency of someone who has had a great deal of practice. The young man across the table had Dorian Thornvale's jaw and Isolde Merrow's eyes, and Rosalind Ashby picked up her wine glass and took a very slow, very deliberate sip and said, in the smoothest voice she owned, "And where are you from originally, Mr. Merrow?" "Wiltshire," he said, with the small, courteous smile of someone who has been asked this question before and answered it without offering anything additional. "And your family?" "My mother," he said simply. "She is everything." Rosalind set down her glass. "Yes," she thought, "I imagine she is." She called on him the following week, which was unusual enough to be noticed. She did not explain herself. She sat in the small, spare office he occupied at the top of the Gower Street building and looked at him with her pale, gray-blue eyes for a long moment. And then she said, "I knew your mother." The room became very still. "I know who you are," Rosalind continued. "I know what you are. And I suspect, given that you are here, in this city, in this particular season, that you have not come simply to draw buildings." Callum looked at her with Isolde's composure and Dorian's intensity and said quietly, "What is it that you think I've come to do?" "I think you've come to be seen," she said. "And I think you are waiting to see what happens when the right people see you." A pause. Something shifted in his expression, not surprise exactly, but the particular acknowledgement of a person who has been correctly read. "And are you," he said, "one of the right people?" Rosalind was quiet for a moment. Outside, London went about its business with magnificent indifference. She thought about a dinner table 20 years ago, and a woman who had smiled with too much careful composure, and a choice Rosalind had made not to ask questions that might have required her to act on the answers. "I intend to be," she said, "if you'll allow it." Dorian Thornvale saw him for the first time at the Royal Institute of Architects' autumn exhibition, which he attended only because his solicitor had suggested it, and he had run out of reasons to refuse things. He was 51 years old, and he was, by every observable measure, a man who had arrived at the life he had constructed for himself and found it entirely sufficient. The estate ran well. His investments were sound. He attended the necessary dinners and sat on the necessary committees and moved through the world with the contained precision of a man who had long ago decided that feeling things deeply was not a transaction worth making. He had not remarried. He had not, in any way that he would have articulated to himself, mourned. He had simply continued, the way a house continues standing after the fire that takes one of its rooms. The structure remains. You learn not to look at that particular wall. He was standing before a drawing of a proposed civic building. Clean lines, an unexpected and rather beautiful use of natural light through a vaulted ceiling, when he became aware of a young man standing a few feet away, studying the same work. He did not look immediately. He looked at the drawing. Then, with the casual peripheral attention of a man at a social occasion, he glanced sideways, and the floor did something it had not done in 20 years. He looked away. Then, unable not to, he looked back. The young man was perhaps 20, 21, dark hair, the particular set of the jaw, and when he turned, as though sensing the attention, which he almost certainly was, pale green eyes that were absolutely not, the eyes of anyone in the Thornvale line. Dorian looked at those eyes and felt something tear open in the center of his chest, with the quiet, devastating efficiency of a seam giving way. He said nothing. He turned. He walked with perfect composure to the far end of the room and stood with his back to the wall and his hand closed around the pocket watch in his breast pocket. His father's watch, the one he carried without thinking, and he breathed. His solicitor appeared at his elbow moments later with a glass of wine and the oblivious cheerfulness of a man who had noticed nothing. "Remarkable young draftsman, isn't he?" he said, nodding toward Callum. "Name of Merrow. Exceptional talent. Lady Ashby has been quite championing him." "Merrow," Dorian repeated. The name landed in him like a stone into still water, circles spreading before he could stop them. "Yes, from Wiltshire, apparently. No particular family to speak of." Dorian Thornvale looked at the young man across the room, at the jaw, the eyes, the particular way he held himself, composed and self-contained in the manner of someone raised to need nothing from anyone, and he thought, with the slow, shattering clarity of a man who has been wrong for 20 years and is only now beginning to understand the full dimensions of it. No particular family. God. The letter came 3 days later. It was delivered to his study by his solicitor, who set it on the desk with an expression of considerable discomfort, and said only, "This was kept by Silas Price, Your Grace. He asked that it be delivered to you now. He said he was too old to carry it any longer." Dorian opened it alone, in the room where he had once stood at the window while a woman walked out of his life without looking back. It was in Silas's precise, careful hand, dated 1891, never sent. It described, in the methodical language of a man who has weighed every word, the conversation Silas had overheard between Lord Henry Marsh and a junior member of Dorian's household. The source of the accusation, the mechanism of the lie, the careful construction of a rumor designed to reach the Duke at the precise moment when his pride would be most easily weaponized against his own judgment. Dorian read it once. Then he set it flat on the desk and pressed both hands against it, as though he could absorb the words through his palms, as though understanding them more fully might somehow revise what they meant. It did not. He sat in the chair, the same desk, the same room, and he was very still for a very long time. Outside the window, London continued, indifferent, magnificent, entirely unconcerned with the cost of a single furious night, now arriving, 20 years late, with the full weight of everything it had always been. She had not been to London in 20 years. Isolde stood on the platform at Paddington in the grey October morning and felt the city press against her like a sound she had forgotten she knew. The smell of coal and rain and the particular density of too many lives occupying the same air. She had received Rosalind's letter 4 days prior, 3 pages, close written, in the hand of a woman who had decided, finally, that the time for comfortable distance was over. "He has seen Callum," the letter said. "He knows. And Silas Price has sent the letter. Isolde, he knows everything. I think you should come." She had read it at the kitchen table in the cottage, in the early morning, with her tea going cold beside her. Then she had folded it very carefully and placed it in her pocket, and gone to stand at the window that looked out onto the garden, bare now in autumn, the ash trees stripped and patient, and she had stood there for a long time, feeling the weight of 20 years arrange itself around her like a landscape she had lived in so long she had stopped seeing it clearly. Callum had appeared in the doorway behind her. He had known, she suspected, for some time that this moment was approaching. He had that quality, her son, of a person who prepares quietly, without announcement, and is ready before anyone else knows readiness was required. "Rosalind?" he asked. "Yes." A pause. "Will you go?" She turned from the window, looked at him. 21 years old, standing in her kitchen doorway with his father's jaw and her eyes, and 20 years of a life she had built from almost nothing, and felt a love so complete and so painful that it briefly took the words from her. "I think I must," she said. He nodded once. Then, "I'll come with you. Callum, not to perform anything," he said quietly. "Not to claim anything. Just, I would like to be there, if you'll have me." She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said, "I'll have you." Rosalind had arranged it with the precise, guilty efficiency of a woman making amends through logistics. A private sitting room at her townhouse on Belgrave Square. A fire. Tea that no one would drink. 4 chairs arranged in the unconscious geometry of a confrontation. Isolde arrived first. She sat with her back straight and her hands in her lap, and her gold locket at her throat. She had worn it deliberately. The same locket, the one she had worn on every day of the last 20 years, because it was the one piece of herself she had not been willing to put down. And she waited. She heard him before she saw him. His step in the hallway. She recognized it with a shock that moved through her entire body, the particular rhythm of it, unhurried and deliberate. The step of a man who has never needed to rush because the world has always waited for him. Then the door opened. 20 years. She had imagined this moment many times, in the involuntary way that the mind returns to its unresolved things in the dark and the quiet. She had imagined rage, and she had imagined coldness, and she had imagined a version of herself that met him with such perfect composure that he would understand, without a word being necessary, exactly what he had made her into. She had not imagined that he would look, simply, like a man who had not slept. Dorian Thornvale stood in the doorway of Rosalind's sitting room and looked at Isolde, and all the things she had prepared, the composure, the distance, The careful architecture of a woman who needed nothing from him became, briefly, insufficient. He was older. Of course he was. The dark hair had silver at the temples now, and the lines of his face had deepened in the particular way of a man who has spent 20 years holding himself very tightly together. But the eyes were the same, storm gray and pale and sharp, and she had not expected this. Devastated. Not performing devastation, simply, quietly devastated. "Isolde," he said. Just her name. The way he had said it once, long ago, in a different register entirely. The register of a man who had not yet decided to stop letting himself feel things. She had not heard her name in that particular voice in 20 years, and she had not understood until this moment that she had been carrying the absence of it. "Dorian," she said. Rosalind, with the tact of a woman who had earned her role in this scene, quietly withdrew. He did not sit. He stood near the fireplace, one hand on the mantel, in the unconscious mirror of the posture she remembered from the study at Thornvale. And then, as though he recognized it himself, he deliberately stepped away from it, moved to the chair across from hers, sat. A man choosing, for once, not to stand with his back to the room. "The letter," he began. "I know about the letter," she said. "Then you know that what I was told—" "I know what Silas wrote," she said. Her voice was steady. She had not known it would be until it was. "I also know that you believed it, without asking me, without one question, Dorian. One question would have been sufficient." The words were not spoken in anger. That was perhaps what made them land so precisely. They were spoken in the tone of a woman who has had 20 years to move through anger and arrive on the other side of it at something cleaner and more final, the plain statement of a fact that could not be revised. He absorbed it without deflecting. "Yes," he said, "you are right." The silence that followed was not comfortable, but it was honest, which was something they had never quite managed before. "I have thought about that night," he said after a moment, "more than I have thought about most things in my life. I have considered every version of what I might have done differently, and I have—" He stopped. His jaw tightened briefly, then released. "There is no version in which what I did was anything other than a failure, of judgment, of everything I should have been." Isolde looked at him, at the silver in his hair and the lines of his face and the hands that were resting, open on his knees, not braced, not closed, open. "I am not here for your remorse," she said quietly. "I have not come for an apology, though I will note that you have given me something resembling one, and I have received it. I am here because my son is in this city, and I will not have him navigate what comes next without me beside him." Something moved across Dorian's face at the word son. A tectonic thing, barely visible, deep. He stopped. "He is extraordinary," Isolde said, and her voice, for the first time, carried something warm beneath the steadiness. "He is kind, and he is brilliant, and he has your jaw and my eyes, and 20 years of a life you did not give him and I did. And he is not angry, Dorian, which is more than you deserve, and exactly what I would expect of him." Callum came in 20 minutes later. He had been in the garden, Rosalind had told her, waiting, with the composure of someone who understood that some conversations must happen before the larger one can begin. He stood in the doorway and looked at his father, and his father looked at him, and the room held its breath. It was not a dramatic moment in the way that Isolde had half expected it to be. There was no great speech, no collapse of feeling. There was simply a young man and an older one looking at each other across a sitting room in London and recognizing, with the helpless physical certainty of blood, what they were to each other. Dorian stood, slowly, as though his body was performing the most careful motion it had ever been asked to make. "Mr. Merrow," he said. "Your Grace," Callum said. A pause that contained 20 years. Then Callum said quietly, with the directness of his mother and the precision of his father, "I have not come to take anything from you. I want you to understand that clearly before anything else is said. I have a name and a life and a mother who gave me everything that mattered. What I came to London for, what I am still here for, is not a title." "Then what?" Dorian asked. His voice was low, not commanding now, something more unguarded. Callum was quiet for a moment. "Then, I wanted to see if you were worth the grief it cost her." The silence that followed was the most honest thing the room had contained in 20 years. Dorian looked at his son, at the jaw and the eyes and the particular self-possession of a young man who had been raised to need nothing and had somehow, against all the mathematics of his situation, become someone, and he said nothing for a long time. Then, very quietly, "I am not certain that I am, but I intend to spend whatever time remains to me attempting to be." Callum looked at him for a long moment with those pale green eyes that were his mother's entirely. Then he turned to Isolde. Something passed between them. The private language of 20 years of mornings and kitchens and hands across tables. She gave him the smallest nod. He turned back to the Duke. Then, he said, "Perhaps we might sit down." The restoration of Isolde Merrow's honor was not a dramatic thing. It did not happen in a ballroom with gasps and turned heads and the satisfying theater of a society that had forgotten her suddenly remembering. It happened, as most things of real consequence happen, quietly, in a series of deliberate acts, each one small and each one irreversible, accumulating over the weeks that followed that afternoon in Rosalind's sitting room into something that could not be undone. Dorian began with the legal. He met with his solicitor the morning after, with a directness that the man, accustomed to years of his employer's preference for not discussing certain matters, found slightly alarming. He instructed him to prepare the documentation acknowledging Callum as his legitimate heir. He signed it without pausing to reconsider, in the manner of a man who has finished reconsidering and arrived, finally, at the other side of it. Then he wrote to Lord Henry Marsh. That letter he composed alone, late at night, at the desk in his study. He did not keep a copy. What he said in it was between himself and the man who had spent 20 years living comfortably inside the silence his lie had created. But the effect of it was visible within a fortnight. Marsh resigned quietly from 2 committees. He declined 3 invitations he would previously have accepted. He became, in the way of men who have been precisely and privately confronted with their own conduct, considerably less present. London noticed, because London always notices, without ever quite being able to say what it is noticing. Rosalind, for her part, did what she did best. She talked. Not loudly. She had never needed volume. She talked at dinners and at morning calls, and at the small, carefully composed gatherings where the real business of society has always been conducted. And what she said was measured and deliberate, and utterly without the quality of gossip, which gave it, paradoxically, far more force than gossip would have had. She spoke of Isolde Merrow as though she had always spoken of her, as though the intervening 20 years were a gap in the conversation, rather than an erasure. She mentioned, with the casual authority of a woman who has never needed to justify her opinions, that the young architect Merrow was a talent of considerable distinction. She placed Isolde beside her at a concert at the Wigmore Hall in the 4th week, and sat with her back straight and her expression pleasantly neutral, while the room adjusted itself to this new information. The room adjusted. Rooms, in Rosalind's experience, generally did. Isolde sat beside her and looked at the musicians, and felt, in the candlelit warmth of that hall, the strange and complicated sensation of being returned to a world she had not asked to re-enter. She was not the woman who had left it. That woman had been younger and more frightened, and had not yet understood what she was capable of surviving. The woman sitting in the 4th row at the Wigmore Hall had survived it entirely, and knew it. She and Dorian met 4 more times before the month was out, always at Rosalind's house initially. Neutral ground, with tea and the implicit presence of a woman who had appointed herself, with some justice, the architect of this particular piece. Then, once, at his request, at Thornvale itself. She had not been prepared for that. She had thought herself prepared. She had stood at the window of the carriage as it turned through the gates, the iron gates, the ones she had not looked back at, and she had held herself very still and reminded herself that she was not the woman who had left through them, and that the cottage in Wiltshire was her home now, and that she did not need this place to be anything other than what it was. Then she had seen the east wing and the particular angle of the morning light across the stone, and her throat had closed without her permission. Dorian met her at the door himself, not the housekeeper, not the footman, himself, standing on the steps in the gray morning light with no performance about him, simply a man waiting. "Thank you for coming," he said. "You asked," she said. "So I came." They walked the grounds for an hour. Not the house. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. That was not what this was. But the gardens, which had changed and also had not. The roses she had planted along the south wall were enormous now, 20 years of growth having made them something she barely recognized as the things she had put into the ground with her own hands in the first autumn of her marriage. "I kept them," he said, when he saw her looking. She did not answer immediately. She looked at the roses, overgrown and extraordinary, climbing the stone with the patient ambition of something that had been left to become entirely itself. "They didn't need you to," she said finally. "They would have grown regardless." He was quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, "Yes, I know." It was not an apology. It was something more precise, the acknowledgement of a man who understood that certain things flourish in spite of being abandoned, and that this is not comfort, but its own kind of verdict. Callum received the formal acknowledgement of his name in November, at a small ceremony that was private by design and public by inevitable consequence. He stood in a solicitor's office on Gray's Inn Road and signed his name, Callum Thornvale, by right of birth, and felt, he told his mother afterward, less than he had expected to feel. "Is that strange?" he asked. They were walking along the embankment in the late afternoon, the river gray and wide and indifferent beside them. "No," she said. "The name was always yours. Having it written down doesn't change what it was." He considered this. "I still want to be Merrow," he said. "Professionally. The work I've built, that's Merrow's work." "Then be both," she said. "You are allowed to be more than one thing." He looked at her sideways, in the particular way he had, assessing, warm, faintly amused. "Is that advice you're giving me, or yourself?" She laughed. It surprised her, the ease of it, the genuine, uncomplicated sound of it in the cold November air. She had laughed in the cottage, in the years of exile, but it had always carried something beneath it, a minor note of something unresolved. This laugh was clean. "Perhaps both," she said. The last conversation she had with Dorian that autumn happened without planning. She had been leaving Rosalind's house late on a Tuesday evening, and he had been arriving. They had not known the other would be there, and they met on the front steps in the lamplight with the faint awkwardness of two people who have become accustomed to prepared meetings and are temporarily without the preparation. "I won't keep you," he said. "You're not," she said. A pause. The city moved around them, unconcerned. "Are you well?" he asked. The question was simple. It was also, she understood, the question underneath which lived all the other questions he had not earned the right to ask yet, and was not asking. A restraint that cost him something, and that she could see clearly it cost him, and that she found herself unexpectedly respecting. "I am," she said. "Better than well, I think. I am myself, which is more than I was when I left." He looked at her for a moment in the lamplight, at the gold locket at her throat, and the pale green ring, and the woman who had walked out of his gates 20 years ago, with 2 words and a secret she had carried alone, and who was standing before him now with the particular luminosity of someone who has been tested completely and has not been diminished by any of it. "Isolde," he said, and stopped. She waited. "I don't expect—" He paused again, the precision of a man choosing words with the care they should always have been given. "I don't expect anything. I want you to know that. Whatever this is, whatever it becomes or doesn't become, I am not asking you to return to what we were. I understand that is not available. I am asking only—" "Dorian," she said gently. He stopped. "Ask me nothing tonight," she said. "We have time. That is, perhaps, the one thing we now have that we didn't have before." He was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in his face. Not the Duke, not the armor, not the man who had stood at a window with his back to the room. Something older and simpler and much more honest than any of those things. "Yes," he said, "we do." She descended the last step onto the pavement. Then, after a moment, she looked back, the way she had not looked back 20 years ago when the carriage pulled away from the gates. She looked back. He was still standing on the steps, watching her, with the expression of a man who understands, at last, that watching someone leave and trusting they are not gone are two entirely different things. She did not smile. She did not need to. She turned and walked into the lamp-lit London evening, and the city received her, not as it had received her before, not as a duchess to be managed and eventually discarded, but as herself, entirely, which was the only version of her arrival that had ever mattered. Behind her, the door of Rosalind's house opened and closed, and the night, unhurried, continued. If this story moved you, you already know what it means to believe in something that took too long to arrive. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because the next story is already waiting, and it will not be kind to those who hesitate. Tell me in the comments, do you think Isolde should give Dorian a second chance? Or has too much time already passed? The answer might surprise you.